Have you ever met someone like this before? You meet a friend, you kick it off right away. When the two of you are at a concert together, you run into someone you both know, and your new friend tells you that this person was awful to them last year. You're taken aback by their horrid experience, and you vow to avoid this person who mistreated them. But over time, you start to notice that your friend has a lot of people who've hurt them. Every 6 months ago, they're cycling through a new friend breakup or real breakup where they were the victimized party. You start to feel this palpable, you're either with me or against me attitude. And frankly, you're afraid of what they might do if you don't 100% support them, so your social network gets thinner and thinner as you keep cutting people off for them. At one point, though, you actually witness the victimization in question, and you start to realize that your friend has completely distorted what happened. They're framing this other person as someone terrible who's deeply wounded them, when in reality it was a much more ambiguous and nuanced situation than that. You tell your friend, I'm just going to stay out of it, I'm just not going to get involved and pick a side, and what do you know? Before long, your friend is rallying their friends about how you harmed them too. If this sounds familiar, you may have come into contact with what research calls a person with a tendency for interpersonal victimhood, or TIV, which is when a person sees themselves as a victim very chronically, even in situations where it may not be objectively true. New research has confirmed something that psychologists long ago theorized, that people who tend to chronically declare themselves as victims are often high in narcissism, and one specific type of narcissism in particular. I'm going to break down the study and tell you what real-life applications we can draw from it. So the study in question talked about how the tendency for interpersonal victimhood, or TIV, is a personality construct characterized by chronically feeling victimized even across different environments and relationships. It contains 4 dimensions: a need for recognition of one's suffering, basically I want people to know how badly I've been treated; moral elitism, this idea that other people are morally bad unlike me; lack of empathy, this feeling that once you hurt me I lose all compassion for you; and rumination on past offenses, where I can't stop thinking about how I was harmed by this person. But hold on, isn't this a pretty typical reaction for someone who's actually been victimized? When someone's been victimized, they of course want other people to know that an injustice has happened. Of course they're going to think the person that hurt them is not a good person. Of course they might struggle to feel empathy for someone who's treated them with very little empathy. Of course they might get stuck in that mental space where they keep ruminating over what happened to them. You're absolutely right. This scale doesn't measure objective victimhood, it measures perceived victimhood. And when someone has just genuinely been victimized in some way, whether they've been abused, scapegoated, betrayed, harassed, discriminated, sabotaged, traumatized, they're probably going to score high on the scale. They perceive that they've been victimized because they have been victimized. But this scale isn't about measuring their feeling towards one person or at one point in time or in one situation. This scale is about their pervasive feeling of victimhood across contexts, across relationships, across time. If someone feels chronically victimized across multiple systems, multiple relationships, it's possible that they're the unluckiest person in the world, but it's also possible that something else might be going on with the way they see themselves in the world. So the aim of the study was to see whether TIV and what's called victim signaling, which is publicly expressing one's suffering, are closer to vulnerable or grandiose narcissism. Now, narcissism, as we know it, is a defense against deep self-loathing. Narcissists actually really hate themselves. They feel really disgusted with themselves, but they wear this mask of arrogance and entitlement and exploitativeness so that they're not in touch with those deeper feelings. Now, vulnerable and grandiose narcissism are 2 subtypes of narcissism. They're not in the DSM-5, but they're largely discussed within narcissism literature, where grandiose narcissism is kind of the more stereotypical version of narcissism that we envision, the person who's very arrogant and grandiose and thinks they're a hotshot, whereas vulnerable narcissism is someone who's more vulnerable, who experiences a greater deal of self-criticism, social anxiety, basically just a type of narcissist who's much more in touch with the underlying deep self-loathing. The way I kind of think about it is a grandiose narcissist has their defenses really, really high where they're not in touch with that deep self-loathing. A vulnerable narcissist, they still take part in those defenses, but they're also a lot more in touch with what's under them. So the study looked at 400 participants in Canada. They were aged 18 to 71, and they assessed the 2 types of narcissism, the tendency for interpersonal interpersonal victimhood, victim signaling, and the big 5 personality traits. What were the findings of the study? Personality traits show us a distinct pattern in how people perceive a sense of victimhood. A victim complex predicted both grandiose and vulnerable narcissism, but in different ways. For grandiose narcissism, it's more about directly signaling their victimhood in order to get attention or some other secondary gain, rather than actually feeling hurt. The employee who's always coming to their boss with some sob story about why they can't do their job competently, why they were late for the 7th time in a row, because they want to keep slacking. They're not actually feeling victimized in some way. They're not actually really suffering. They're putting on this facade of suffering in order to get something. But for vulnerable narcissism, it seems there's a level of genuine hypersensitivity, which interacts with their entitlement to cause a pervasive sense of victimhood. So in this situation, let's say an employee who's always getting into fights with their coworkers, who's always perceiving these microscopic aggressions from other people and genuinely feels hurt, so they're always signaling that hurt to other people. They're always framing themselves as a victim. For vulnerable narcissists, it's much more about fragility and victimhood. Why is it about entitlement? Because if you think about it, a person who is entitled thinks that they should get special treatment, that they should never suffer, that life should just hand them anything they want. So if they're not getting those things to which they feel entitled, they feel like a victim because of it. Their victimhood is directly tied to their entitlement. The tendency for interpersonal victimhood was more strongly linked to vulnerable narcissism. So it does seem to be true that vulnerable narcissists have this victim complex more strongly. Victim signaling was also linked to higher extroversion and openness to experiences, as well as lower agreeableness. So here we're talking about big 5 personality traits. So the prototype you could think of is someone who's outgoing and emotionally open and expressive, but very self-centered and antagonistic. Maybe someone like Carrie Bradshaw, if I were to pick. The study had certain limitations, namely it was cross-sectional, so we can't assume causality. It was a Canadian sample, it's not necessarily representative of everybody. And the researcher was interviewed by someone who did an article on this study, and he really wanted to emphasize that the findings of his study should not be used to infer anything about politics or real victimization. The tendency to view oneself as a chronic victim exists regardless of background, regardless of politics, regardless of objective circumstances. But what are the real-life applications of this study? This gives us a window into the personality type of people who constantly so quickly veer into, I was wronged in some way. Let me give you an example. I once watched an interaction between 2 people. Person A mentioned she doesn't want to have kids, and person B asked, oh, I'm curious, how come? Person A then flew off the handle, started talking about how I don't owe you an explanation, blah, 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 blah. Turns out person B was also child-free and wanted to know if they had similar motives behind the choice. And it wasn't like person A had some sort of latent trauma about being child-free. She was like this with everything. You could have told her, I like your hair today, and she would have been like, what do you mean by that? Some people will twist even the most innocuous interactions into something to be offended by. How does this show up in relationships? Sometimes a person will refuse to take ownership over their own contribution to conflicts, where it's always 100% the other person's fault. Even in situations where an objective observer would think, well, actually, you kind of made a few mistakes too, if we're being honest. They also might really struggle to feel empathy for the other person's point of view in a conflict, because they've already decided that person is morally corrupt, that person has wronged me, they've victimized me in some way. So it always comes back to acknowledge my perspective, validate my feelings, but never do they turn around and go, I can see how you might see things from your perspective as well. It's always like this in relationships with them. It's always my perspective is the correct one. Small or ambiguous issues tend to get blown out of proportion for them. With a person like this, they're eventually going to find evidence of the crime that they're looking for, no matter how hard you try to be perfect. They will read into a moment when you're a little bit quiet that has nothing to do with them. They will hear you say things in a much more aggressive way than you said it, to the point where, if you were to ask them to paraphrase what you said, you would realize they just heard a total distortion. You could say to them, hey, could you take the dishes out of the dishwasher? And they might hear, why haven't you taken the dishes out of the dishwasher yet, you lazy and bad person? People like this also tend to bring up past wrongs that you've committed against them even years later. That one time that you made a logistical mistake and rectified it as soon as it was brought to your attention, that one time years ago when you said something in a hurtful way and you apologized for it, that one misunderstanding between the two of you, it constantly gets brought back up. It constantly needs to be processed again. We're not talking here about actual betrayals, by the way. It's normal to still need to rehash things when somebody's been betrayed, sometimes even years after the fact. I'm talking about minor everyday brushes with conflicts that are just a normal part of two people being in a relationship with each other. Or in more extreme cases, a person who constantly sees themselves as a victim might resort to Darvo, where they actually victimize someone else, but they flip it to somehow portray themselves as the victim. If you're dealing with somebody like this, at some point you really gotta stop arguing about what you did or didn't do and just cut the cycle. Don't explain, don't justify, don't defend yourself. It will get twisted, it will get used against you. You can validate their feeling, that can sometimes de-escalate things without encouraging their behavior. You can say, I understand that you feel hurt, or I can see why you might see things that way. You can send the message that their feeling is real and likely stems from a much more core wound that, probably happened years ago, probably during their development, and they let it become a part of their personality. And you can also stay strong to your boundaries while validating their feeling. You can state your point of view, stated just once, then stop engaging, stop negotiating what happened or what you did, and don't accept character assassinations. So that might sound like saying, from my perspective, I just wanted to know your reasons for being child-free because I also don't want kids, and sometimes it makes me feel less alone to hear other people sharing their reasons why. If they start smearing your name to everyone, or maybe even to your own face, you can say, I don't appreciate how you mischaracterized our conversation earlier. So if you put it all together, it can sound something like this. I understand you feel hurt, that my question probably stirred a lot of emotional validation that you've experienced in the past about being asked why you don't want to have kids. From my perspective, I just wanted to know your reasons because I also don't want kids, and it helps me feel more seen to hear other people's reasons. With that being said, I would appreciate it if you stopped mischaracterizing our conversation to third parties. It's probably not going to work. They're probably still going to frame themselves as a victim, but what can you do? You can't control what they're going to do. All you can do is state your perspective, set a boundary, do it once, disengage. What about if you're someone like this? If you're hearing this and if you're being honest, it's like, maybe I have a little bit of a tendency for interpersonal victimhood. You got to realize that in the short term, you may gain certain benefits like attention and sympathy that feel really good initially, but it's not worth the long-term costs. Another study actually recently found that people who chronically signal victimhood are perceived as more narcissistic by other people. So people tend to clock it, they tend to clock this behavior, and they kind of get tired of it. You also have to realize that if you always move through life seeing yourself as a victim, it builds resentment, you start to self-sabotage your relationships, you start to isolate yourself across time. You are the type of person who needs to learn how to let go of a grudge. And something very specific you can do if you want to figure out how to stop holding a grudge is define what specific behaviors constitute real harm for you. So if a person does XYZ thing, that is real harm, that is real victimhood, and you are completely within your right to feel victimized by it. But then hold yourself to a very strict standard about not claiming to be a victim unless that line has been crossed, unless X, Y, or Z has been done. And also in relationships, always ask yourself, how did I contribute to this? And what might the other person's perspective be? Thank you for watching. Tell me what you